So today we're looking at a video from the Penuel show where he's interviewing Zwai Bala, and most of you will know Zwai as a music legend in South Africa, someone who's won a lot of awards, someone who was part of the TKZ music family. Now he's also got a reality TV show along with his brothers. And he's someone who actually still sings choral music. He sings gospel music. But very interesting, he's someone who left the church a number of years ago. And in the reality TV show that he stars in along with his brothers, I know Uloyiso Bala is someone who's a Christian. And you'll notice in the show that you can see that one practices African spirituality, the other one practices Christianity, and you can see these two things or two ideas clashing whenever their families come together and there are functions. You know, Uzwai will want to speak to the grave, speak to his ancestors, but Uloyiso is not someone who speaks to his ancestors. Now, in this interview, he talks about black people suffering. And we know black people have suffered a lot in terms of colonialism, slavery. Those were some of the most brutal and dark moments in the history of Africa. Now, he goes on to say that actually black people have suffered more than Jesus. So this is the question we're going to be addressing today. We're going to be actually reacting maybe to two more. We'll make two more videos after this one, just dealing with some of the things he deals with. But in this particular one, I want to focus on this idea of the suffering of Jesus and the suffering of maybe some of our liberation heroes, to say that maybe we draw too much attention to the death of Jesus, and maybe we don't focus so much on the death of some of our liberation heroes. But really, should we be talking about these things separately? Or should we both see these things as people who suffered on behalf of black people? So that's what we're going to be dealing with today. So let's have a look at our video, and then I'll give some commentary towards the end.
Do you think you'll ever go back to the church?
Oh, hell no.
Hell,
I love
hell no. Hell no.
Yeah.
Please.
No, look, I mean, not as a, I mean, look, we sing Christian songs.
Gospel music is the best music on the planet. I'm not
you know
Christian
what I'm saying,
anymore,
Joe? And now I'm glad.
amazing.
I have my own worship moments where I just sit and just like, you know
Praise
what I'm saying?
and worship is amazing.
You know what I'm saying? But for me, it's like praise and worship. Yeah, it's that space where you're like so emotionally vulnerable. You just come there, and that connection is not what the Bible is necessarily.
But isn't that still God and Jesus?
Yeah, whatever.
In those moments? No, in that special vulnerability?
Joe, we connecting with the spirit, not la tata kabani. Okay? Which is what I believe that a lot of us go to church for. That's why if you had to cut out the preaching and all that stuff, people are still going to church to be in that space. Tina classic cula singotaki, chap. This is Africanism for me. Class cula singotaki, especially class semoyeni. Abantu bayaphila without mentioning the name of Jesus.
The lyrics almost don't matter. Sports,
it doesn't.
Church, it's not about the lyrics.
There's so many songs that I remember since school. Did you hear on the Kumula Longo? But I've actually never quite thought through the words. I'm like, you know? But when it's like, he was ripped for me. You know, like it's like, hey, these things are hectic. But now let's go even just to that text. There are many black people that have suffered a lot more than what they say Jesus did.
Did you just say that?
This is now for us. Yes. No, I'm not talking about what I do not know. I'm talking about what I know and what I have read. It's not an opinion here. Okay?
When they say,
they were spitting on him, they were whatever. I'm like, what? Really? That's all?
There are many black people that have gone through way worse than what Jesus did.
And that was for us. This is a story I do not know for sure, and I'm not disregarding it. Okay? We know of true stories where black people were tortured, and some prepared to even die for the freedom of black people. true stories that we know.
So there you have it, guys. Zwai, Utikela, Unoni is basically saying that the death of Jesus, while he's not actually undermining it, he's saying there are more reliable stories of black people dying for black people. Now, for me, it's very important that I address the historicity of the death of Jesus before we talk about the black liberation movements, because I think that the historicity of Jesus' death has a significant impact also on the liberation movement. It's just that a lot of people these days are so caught up in what the internet has to say about Christianity that they don't actually go and look at the facts for themselves. And that's why people like Zwai, I respect him so much, I love his music, but he's not an expert on church history. He's not an expert on Christian theology. And so this makes it very difficult now for a musician, though we're not saying people cannot comment, but I think that the minute you delve into historical matters, you've got to actually go deep and study and look at these things without just maybe listening to a video from Bishop Maponga or Abba Aelew and so on. But you really got to go out and read these things for yourself. Now, the historical Jesus is something that is widely accepted by scholars today. You have leading atheist scholars who don't believe in Christianity, who don't accept Christian theology, but affirm that Jesus Christ died on the cross and he was crucified by the Romans. And one of those scholars is Bart Ehrman. Now, Bart Ehrman says the idea that Jesus did not exist is a modern notion. It has no ancient precedents. He says the reality is that every single author who mentions Jesus, whether they were pagan, whether they were Christian, we're talking about the early church fathers, or Jewish, was convinced that Jesus had lived, at least that he had lived. And then he says even the enemies of the Jesus movement thought that Jesus was someone who actually lived. And there's a lot of things that they said against Christianity. But the fact that Jesus did not exist was never something that was mentioned by ancient historians. So this is very important to know that this is something that is new. It comes from books like the Da Vinci Code and all sorts of conspiracy theories that come now in the later times. That's why we say that our generation, more than any other generation, wants to wipe out Jesus out of the face of history. You've also got other leading historians like Gert Ludemann, who also accepted that Jesus Christ was someone who was a first century Jewish preacher. His believers or followers were convinced that he had died on the cross, and that his followers were convinced that they had seen him rise from the dead. Now, this is very significant because you don't just have the attestation or the church actually saying that Jesus Christ was someone who died and rose again, but you actually also have ancient historians like Josephus. You also have Tacitus. You also have Pliny the Younger. All these people actually mention that Christianity originates from Jesus Christ, who was someone who performed miracles, who was also crucified under the Romans. Now, this is also interesting because if we acknowledge then that Jesus Christ was someone who died, then what do we say about his resurrection? Now, it's very important that we understand that if Jesus Christ did not rise from the dead, it's impossible for early Christianity to emerge out of Jerusalem and out of Israel, because we have evidence of early Christians who are actually also martyred and killed for their faith. We have people like Ignatius. These are the early Christian martyrs who were convinced that Jesus Christ had actually risen from the dead, and that's why they were willing to die for their faith. This was the conviction that they had, that if Jesus had rose from the dead and people were actually trying to convince them not to speak about Jesus Christ, then those people were willing to die. They would never be willing to die for a lie. Now, what does this actually have to do with black liberation? It's very important that we also understand that Jesus didn't just inspire the early church, but he also inspired the liberation movement leaders. So we're talking about, for an example, people like Albert Luthuli, who made a very fundamental statement, who said, the struggle for freedom in South Africa is based on the teachings of Christ. And then he said, freedom comes through the cross. Now, this is something that is very powerful, because you've got one of the early leaders of the ANC who are saying our struggle for freedom in South Africa is based on the teachings of Christ. So this means that actually the death of Jesus on the cross didn't just inspire the early church, it also inspired the people that Upud Zwai is talking about. Inspired the black people that actually went and died for the liberation of black people. You'll also recall that people like Robert Sobukwe, someone who was fighting for black liberation, put in prison eventually, who died. But the fact that he was able to go there, his willingness, means that there was something else that must have motivated him and inspired him. Now, of course, to liberate your people is absolutely something that is inspirational. But the teachings of Christ was something that was foundational to their mission, something that was foundational to their cause. It's what actually kept them when they were in prison. They were reading the Bible. And so they were motivated by the selfless act of Christ to give himself on behalf of other people. And this echoes the principle of Ubuntu, or the philosophy of Ubuntu. The greatest expression of Ubuntu is a person giving their lives for others. Because Ubuntu is about not just me being okay, but it's about us being okay. It's about giving yourself to other people. And so Jesus Christ was someone who embodied this philosophy more than anyone. Because Jesus Christ didn't just die for black people, but he also died for Indian people. Because we always emphasize the struggles of black people, and we see struggles only from our perspective, which is understandable. But here in South Africa, we also had Indian people who were taken from India and who were enslaved here in South Africa. Now, we can't just dismiss their suffering because we want to focus on ours. But that's why we say Jesus also died for them as well. And Jesus actually also inspired liberation even in India. Because you'll also recall that Mahatma Gandhi was someone who was inspired by the teachings of Christ. He was someone who actually read the teachings of Christ. He even actually said that he loves Christ. He loves the teachings of Christ. He loves the Sermon on the Mount, but he just doesn't love the Christians, because the Christians actually fail to become like Christ. So he doesn't love the Christians, but he loves Christ. He's inspired by his teachings. And we see that his non-resistance, the movement that eventually, ends colonialism in India, is based on the teachings of Christ. So even Martin Luther King Jr. in the civil rights movement was someone who was also shot and killed for fighting for liberation. He also made the statement that every genuine expression of love grows out of consistent and total surrender to God. This was someone who was a Christian. This was someone who was a believer. So when we talk about the stories of people who gave their lives in order to save black people, now we're not saying all of them were Christian, but we're definitely saying the key ones, the important ones throughout history that have played a significant role in black liberation definitely were drawing from the teachings of Christ. They were inspired by the teachings of Christ. But I think also, if you look at Hebrews chapter 4, verse 15, it says, we do not have a high priest that does not sympathize with us, but rather we have a high priest who was tempted in every way, the same way that we are tempted. And that means that Jesus Christ, because he is God who then became flesh and then entered into our human experience, he understands every single form of pain that we go through. Now we can take this a step further to say that Jesus Christ was someone who was hung and nailed on the cross by the Romans. He was hung on the cross by an oppressive imperial system or a colonial system, right? He was under a colonial system. He was under Roman rule. So he understands what it's like to be oppressed. He understands what it's like to be dominated by maybe your enemies, being dominated by, people who see you as an inferior. Christ actually understands that. And so he understands the suffering of black people. He understands the suffering of every human being in the world because he entered into our human experience. But I think that when we talk about freedom, and I think Chief Albert Luthuli nails this thing when he says freedom comes through the cross, because when we talk about being oppressed, we always see it from the perspective of the person that is being victimized. But do you guys understand just how oppressed or how broken someone has to be for them to actually enslave someone else and capture them and remove them from their home, separate them from their family? There is actually something that is much greater that is oppressing them. So that even though we see the guy in chains as the one that is oppressed, and then we see the guy that is the one that put the other guy in chains, we think it's always the guy that's in chains that's oppressed. But what if it's actually the guy that is the one that's putting the one in chains, who is actually the one that is the one who is the most oppressed, the one who is trapped in pride, the one who is trapped in fear, because it is fear and brokenness that makes people break other people. Now Paul says, he says, I am in chains, but I am free. And then he says, what has happened to me being in prison has inspired other believers to proclaim the truth, to stand up for the truth. And so Paul was basically saying, I understand what freedom is. Chief Albert Luthuli says, I understand what freedom is. I don't mind if people will put me in prison because I have been liberated from the fear of another human being. I've been liberated from pride that controls me, that tells me that I must always be in control, that tells me that I must always dominate other people to find my identity. I must always be the master and superior to other people. I am free from all of that. I am secure in who I am, right? I've been accepted and loved by Christ, found my identity in Christ, so that when someone says I am a slave, I know I'm not a slave because Christ has set me free. And therefore I am willing to go to the prison and suffer for other people so that they would be liberated. But people can be liberated out of chains, but actually they can still be in bondage. Because if we think about it like this, people who were liberated in 1994 in South Africa still went on to oppress each other. Because we see now so much violence against women. We see so much violence of black people killing black people. We're seeing the same thing that the oppressors were doing to us. We're now doing that. We're kidnapping children and we're turning them into traditional medicine. We're killing people, we're killing each other, and we hate each other. So it means that we are also oppressed. And so this is how the death of Jesus Christ is so significant, in that Jesus Christ declares in John chapter 8, he says, whoever sins is a slave to sin. This means that humanity is actually in the greatest form of oppression, which is sin. Because why do we do all these things to each other? Why do we break each other? Why do we kill each other? Why do we hate each other? Why do we want to control each other? It is because we are actually under a greater bondage that needs to be liberated, that needs to be removed in order for us to begin to love each other and to begin to care for each other. So I think that it's important and very fundamental that we understand that when we talk about freedom, that we don't see freedom from a narrow perspective. And that's what Christ really came to do, is to say, yes, we must be liberated. We must have the freedom to determine our future. But if we still are under the control of sin, then are we truly free? And humanity, we can look at humanity, even black people, when we talk about slavery. Black people played a part in slavery. You had the kingdom of Dahomey. You had the kingdom of Ashanti. You had the Yoruba land. Black people sold off other black people to slavery. So they were a part of it. They were part of the oppression. They were a part of the king. I mean, you look at King Shaka Zulu, the amount of oppression and land dispossession that he did among other people. Some of them had to move to Zimbabwe and other places. He killed a lot of people. So human beings have the same problem, whether black or white. And so we believe that the death of Jesus Christ is actually a universal death. He died for all, so that for all those who live might not live for themselves, but would live for him. It is for freedom that Christ has set us free, and that we would live in freedom. And to live in freedom, it means I'm free from trying to control people. I'm free from the fear of other people, that I'm not insecure when I see another person who's different from me, because I know that the same person is made in the image of God, the same way that I'm made in the image of God, that Christ died for me to set me free, that we're all equal, that I don't have to find my identity in being superior to other people, but I can find my identity in the fact that I've been created in the image of God, equal to every other human being. When I see another human being, I see the image of God in them. I don't see an animal. I don't see a dog. I see a person of me. I see a mirror of the living God, and I see a mirror of myself, because that's what Ubuntu is. It is humanity. It is to say I see humanity in you, whether you are different in terms of skin color, but in the inside, all of us are human. So that's my response to Upud Zwai, and I'll be making maybe 1 or 2 other videos. But if you've liked this video, feel free to like, to share, and to subscribe. We'll see you guys on the next video.